On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Teresa Martyny. She's the engineering manager of data OS infrastructure at New Relic. We're going to be talking about risk mitigation. We're going to cover a couple different aspects of the topic. We're going to talk about how you identify the risk, assessing options in an outage in different situations, and what fallback options are. And we're also going to hopefully, if we have enough time to squeeze it in, talk about the impact on the people side, because I think that's a really important part of risk mitigation. Teresa, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's really great to be here.
Thank you. And just to set context for everyone, engineering manager of data OS infrastructure. I know, New Relic, you tell us what they do, but I'm really curious what the actual job you do at New Relic is.
Yeah, naming's fun when you work at a company that's all about data and you work on what would normally be called the data team at any other company. So we work on ingesting data from external and internal sources that the company uses and pulling it into our enterprise data warehouse and our data lake in S3 and Snowflake. And then we have analysts who analyze that data, and we have engineers that are getting data from that warehouse and serving it back out to customers and using it for their own insight into their business.
And just for the audience, what does New Relic do?
Oh, sure. New Relic provides an observability platform. So you can get insight into, it's most well known for the original product, which was APM and applications monitoring. And so now there's the telemetry data platform, and there's a full stack observability piece and artificial intelligence, which can predict outages or anomalies in your data and your system's performance and alert you to that earlier.
Absolutely. All right. So let's, I know we're going to talk about risk mitigation. On our prep call, we talked about how it rolls downhill, but obviously it's got to start someplace. You got to be able to identify a potential risk. You have to be able to spot it before you could even do anything about it. So, talk to me about, I guess, the top, right? Observability and what you're seeing to identify a risk and when that kind of becomes, a pressing issue for you.
Sure. So for the observability piece, that can apply to your systems, it can apply to your data. Most commonly, people are more accustomed to the application of it to their systems. So that's getting your logs, your dashboards, and your alerting going. We apply it also to our data. So we do that through mechanisms like validations. So we have, instead of responding to outages by then executing queries and finding out what's wrong with the data, taking those queries that you would normally run at that time and just throwing them into a job that runs every 15 minutes or whatever a cadence is that works for that particular data set, and getting insight into, is the data as we expect it at all times? Those kinds of validations are both going to be general, like there should be no nulls here, as well as business validations where analysts who work closely with the reports and the things that we're expecting out of that data, being able to apply those assertions earlier. It should only be within a certain range. If it's outside of that range, something's wrong. So then we can get all that insight up front as soon as the data is coming into the systems, rather than when it's just being output to C-suite folks as well as customers.
And I guess when you're looking, there's multiple eyes, there's people looking at those validations. Where are the thresholds? Like when you're looking at what should be something that's alertable to not alertable, and how far should the alarm be rung? And I always talk to security people and I always ask the same thing, because it's like, well, when something goes wrong, it's a question of who needs to know and how loud you need to make it known.
And when? Does someone really need to wake up for this? Yeah. And that kind of comes back to the joy of the engineers too, right? We need to maintain these systems, but we also need to sleep in order to be able to function and maintain these systems. So we have some validations that fail, and then one might also have non-failing validations. And those might actually go straight all the way to the end of the stream to the people who are writing the reports and the analysts, instead of having those alerts go to like an infrastructure team where that's not, we're more about the pipes, less about the like making sure that the data is exactly as expected from the very beginning to the end as far as business context goes. So then it allows the analysts who are expecting the business to be in a certain state to be able to then talk to the people at the top of the pipeline and say, hey, this data is not what we expected. We're not going to break anything. We're not going to stop anything, but this is a flag. And then some alerts might go to Slack so that someone during the business hours can address it, or they might go through PagerDuty to wake somebody up. And that's just about the SLAs that, like, is this a Sev 1? Is it a Sev 5?
So when you're actually looking at some of the validations and in terms of, grading the severity level, how is that done from looking at the overall business needs versus maybe departmental needs or balancing, how severe a potential issue could be?
So the way that we would address that, so we have a core team of analysts on the data OS team. And those analysts have significant, deep insight into the business needs, not just of our team, but of all the analysts throughout the company. And so when we're discussing, they actually originate all of the business validations come from that team. They create them and they let us know what we should be asserting against. So they are having conversations. They have context around the number of teams that use that data, what that data is used for, and how critical that service might be. So there might be data that affects billing. And then there might be data that just affects one report that's a nice to have, but not a critical. And so then they let us know what the severity should be based on all of that information.
So the feedback, I guess, from the analyst level, they understand the business needs that comes to you guys. Do you guys internally assess that at some point just to run a sanity check on, if that fits with what you guys see as potential risks or maybe the issues and complexities involved in you addressing what they're seeing?
We work closely with them in making these assessments. So it's not in a black box. So we would be collaborating together as the things start to fail or start to surface. Then we would discuss with them, is this still doing what we need it to? And tune it from there.
How often does that get refactored just in terms of, reassessing baselines and, determining, severity levels based on just, what's happening to the business and, the experience of dealing with one and versus the other?
I think it's going to depend on the needs of the company and the frequency with which these things are failing. If it's pretty quiet for a long time, you're going to want to have regular check ins anyway, because maybe things are quiet for not the right reasons. Maybe it's not working as expected. Or maybe you're not checking on the right things, or maybe everything's just beautiful. So you want to kind of have touch points there. But then also, if it gets too loud, you're also going to want to fine tune there so that you're addressing the underlying causes, which kind of goes into the resiliency piece of making sure that your systems are resilient. So you're not just waking up engineers all the time, interrupting workflows all the time to play whack a mole with these validations.
I guess just, something you mentioned of, if you're not getting the alerts and nothing's wrong, that may not necessarily be a good thing. Maybe there's the validation's not correct. In those cases, when things are quiet and sometimes you're like, they're just too quiet. What's an example maybe, or what's the scenario in terms of going, you know what? Things are just going too well. There's got to be something that we're missing because obviously, things do need to go wrong. How do you identify that potentially?
Well, I guess I wouldn't say that things need to go wrong because there may have been resiliency built into the system, which is why the validation is quiet. So the validation is more of a fallback should that system fall through. And all too often, those things get surfaced because the thing breaks and you find out from a human. And then you're like, wait, but why didn't this alert go off? And then you go dig into the alert and you find out that for some reason it hasn't been triggering or, there are various things wrong with the system, so you have to fix it. So doing a regular audit is healthy in combination with responding to incidents that come up.
I guess when you're looking at, obviously doing the monthly audit or you're checking in with the human side because obviously the validations are written by people. When you're looking about that human relationship, obviously your counterpart or, the analyst side, you guys work really closely. You guys are involved in understanding the validations. I guess what kind of a relationship is it? Is it, you guys are all sitting at the table, as a team? Is it they're doing their work coming to you? How does the process work?
On my team right now, the way that it works is we have these kickoffs. So we kick off an effort together. And then, everyone's remote. So we're not working at the table together, but the analysts and the engineers work together to identify what the scope is of the types of risks that we're going to address in an effort. And then they would come up with their validations. Often, there was one time when I was working with an analyst and he had like 100 tabs open in data grip. And there are all these different checks that he runs to like assert that the system's good when something goes wrong. So taking those tabs and taking those queries out of a system like data grip and putting them into a validation that runs like an Airflow or something. There's also like a service called Monte Carlo that Bar Moses runs, and they have a tool that's really helpful as well, that they're getting started.
I was curious I know that obviously we're talking about the analyst and having 100 tabs and helping him manage that process a little bit more efficiently is helpful. I was going to actually ask you a step back, like when you're looking at the tools that your team uses and the commonality that other teams are potentially using similar tools. And obviously you mentioned Airflow and, you guys are this area between data engineering and potentially ops and understanding that risk side. Are you seeing tools becoming more commonly used between you and other teams and helping facilitate some of what you're doing?
As far as the observability and resiliency, so we use New Relic's tools. So we serve a lot of this data up into New Relic's insights and logging, and that's how we run these alerts. So when we have a validation task, for example, in Airflow on a set of data, we log out the state of that data, and then we suck those logs up into New Relic's logging tool, and we establish alerts on that. And that feeds over to PagerDuty. So I would say the New Relic tool set is what we use.
Yeah, I was going to say it would be kind of, well, it's positive that using your own tool. Otherwise, it'd be an awkward conversation now of what tool you'd be using.
Well, I mean, so an insight on the state of data, in a warehouse isn't really New Relic's area of expertise, right? It's more on the system side. So we are using New Relic's tools to do something that it's not historically used to do.
Isn't that what all good engineering teams do? They jig up what isn't meant for them, and all of a sudden somebody finds a new use case, and all of a sudden that becomes a new standard.
Yeah, it's been great. And New Relic's has actually been doing quite a bit recently to integrate more with observability into Snowflake, which is lovely, as well as insight into these other systems like Airflow that don't quite work the way that our other systems have.
I was going to ask you when it comes to your actual team. So obviously, I know there's a lot of partnership with the analyst side in terms of understanding validation. We talked about different severity levels will require different response by you guys to address. How does your team? I guess I mean obviously you guys didn't mention you all have to sleep. So I don't know if you guys are taking turns monitoring things overnight, or is it one of those cases where these alerts are stuff that only happens during business hours? How does your team actually tackle the issues when they come up?
Depends on the severity. So some of the data sets that we monitor are very high criticality, and they have interfaces with customers, and the way that gets processed happens at night. So if it fails at night, we need to wake up and fix it. So we have different SLAs on different data sets. So some of them wake us up, some of them don't. Some of them are more backups. So we don't wake up at night to fix those. We fix this during the business hours, and we have backfill mechanisms that we can use. Some of it's aspirational, some of it exists. It's all a process.
And some of those SLAs, when you're looking at them, is that internal to you guys or is that external to customers?
Great question. So there are a couple of things that we have SLAs with our customers that the other teams are abiding by. So we have SLAs with those teams so that they can meet their expectations. I decided to start creating SLAs with teams upstream of us, which I mentioned earlier briefly. And that's been really, really helpful. That's created this human connection between us and the teams that are generating the data and may not have awareness that we are using data in their database. And so, because we're pulling in all the data about our products and ingesting it into our warehouse. And so Yeah, I've had numerous conversations where I start off and I tell them what we do, and I'm like, "Yeah, so we bring your data," and they're like, "Oh, we didn't know anyone was using that data," um, and it's just high level aggregate information, but really forming those relationships results in them reaching out and thinking about us when they make a product change, and them keeping us in the loop when they're starting to think about a new feature, because we may use a certain data set now, but this new data set they're starting would actually be really lovely to use as well. So then we learn about other types of data that we could work with them on ingesting, and how that might change the meaning. Like maybe the old data has shifted its meaning. And so using this new data set makes more sense going forward. So, yeah, having that awareness, you can build in lots of resiliency into your systems through code, but that's going to be a response in the moment when something happens. Building a connection with those humans is going to let you get ahead of the game, because you're going to know months that you could know months ahead that a change is coming. And then the resiliency within the system with code is just like a fallback for the things that fall through.
It's interesting. And I guess from that standpoint, when you're looking at that accountability, somebody has to manage it. I didn't want to use the word police it. Somebody has to monitor it. I mean, we come up with words to dance around it, but when you're establishing that SLA with the upstream teams, how are you setting up that policing, for lack of a better word, just kind of tackle it?
Yeah. So, okay. So we've handled it in a couple of ways. So in the SLA, we state like, this is what we use it for. This is the importance of it so that they understand what the business use is. And then we start with asking, is this a possibility? Is it possible for you to give us this much notice before this thing happens? If something does break our systems, how quickly could you respond? So they know what our needs are, they know what our ask is, and then they can reflect on their capacity and where we can meet in the middle. That's going to work if you've got like 5 teams or 10 teams you work with. When you're working at a massive company where there's a lot more than that, it's a little harder to get all those things nailed down. So then you would want to take it from a place of, you got to codify it on your end by adding in the resiliency to your systems. And then you got to start talking about codifying on their end. So starting to add in checks. I mean, you can do it at a smaller company too, but adding in those checks on their side so that when they start to commit a change that's going to fail something further downstream that's critical to business, that it stops them and they get notified. So you can do that with Git hooks, or, you know, building it into their test suite. There's a variety of approaches you could take there.
Very cool. That sounds like the impact's been pretty positive. At least you guys are aware, your team's aware of what's coming down the downstream versus being reactive. It sounds like that's probably helping being a little proactive in addressing some of the changes that otherwise would break a validation and cause somebody in the middle of the night to wake up to just figure out what the heck just happened.
Yeah.
Awesome. I was going to say it's been really interesting, kind of diving into the mitigation, validation, and especially the partnerships from the analyst side to the upstream teams, and kind of it seems like it's a very web of interaction, especially where you sit with the data and the pipelines that you guys are managing. If somebody wanted to reach out to kind of touch base on anything that you mentioned on the podcast, is LinkedIn a good avenue to do that? Is there a preferred way that you'd like somebody to do that potentially?
Yeah, LinkedIn would work perfectly. I check it pretty regularly. So would love to connect with folks. Yeah, just remembering that everybody's together working as one big team, trying to achieve the same goals is a great way to start building all this resiliency in.
I like that. That's a great way to look at it. And yeah, I can't thank you enough for coming on. We'll include your LinkedIn on the show notes just to make sure somebody can circle back with you. Super interesting topic. And I think when I first saw your job title, I was kind of wondering what you exactly did. We kind of talked about it. I was like, this is actually a really interesting topic. As on a side note, the data engineering space has changed so much as in the last decade, 5 years, 3 years, that small subtle changes now on what you're doing or what somebody else is doing in terms of consuming it is becoming a big enterprise in of itself. It mirrors what the DevOps teams are doing to me. It seems very similar in terms of you need somebody on the monitoring, the ops side to actually understand the impacts that before were less complicated, I guess.
Yeah, it's a fun straddle between DevOps, software engineering, and data analysis and data engineering. It's a jack of all trades type of role.
Yeah, I was just going to think, we're a recruiting company, and I think if data engineers are hard and DevOps engineers are hard to find, your people are probably some kind of purple squirrel unicorn hybrids out there that might take a while to source. And maybe that's a different topic for a different day to talk about how that tackles. But
I'd be happy to talk with you about that sometime. I've done a lot of recruiting in this space, and it's been really lovely. Actually, I have some great thoughts there.
Awesome. Maybe we'll have you back on and we'll tackle that. But I want to thank you. Thanks for being on the show. Been awesome having you, and appreciate your time.
Yep. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again with another guest, different topic. And two things I always ask. One, keep subscribing. That's been a great organic growth to the podcast. People are hopefully enjoying the episodes. And if there's any feedback, that's always my second ask is the feedback is really what I'm looking for. I want to improve the podcast. If you guys have topics that you want to hear, keep messaging those to me on LinkedIn. That's the best place because at least I can then kind of find somebody to talk about those topics. But until next time, thanks.